Good morning. My name is Hugh Jones. I cover financial regulation for Reuters. I used to be based here, just down the road, for about 4 years, for the McCreevy era. But I've also covered the EU from London now for many years. So I remember when the financial crisis began in 2007, in August, when my editor was asking me, what on earth is subprime? What is a credit default swap? So I think we've come a long way since then. I have certainly. Our panel this morning has some deep experience of the crisis and the whole plethora of new rules we've had from Brussels, from the global level, FSB, and variants on the national level. So I think they're all known to you, and we have Andrea Enria here, who's chairman of the European Banking Authority. He's just been reappointed for another 5-year term, so I think he must be doing it right. And we have Pierre Francotte at the far end, formerly head of Euroclear, and now is on Belgium's resolution board, on the board of that, so he will know where all the skeletons are. We also have Sylvie Matera from Deutsche Bank, and we have Urs Rohner, of course, chairman of the board of Credit Suisse Group. I think we're going to go straight into it, about 40 minutes, and I'd like to start really, we heard there that Sir John Cunliffe saying the final design is in place now for regulation, but Axel Weber was not convinced. And can we, what we have seen, though, in the last few years is quite a bit of fragmentation in markets, in capital flows, cross borders that have shrunk. We've seen the issues of the US and the EU of derivatives, the fear of splitting the market there. Perhaps we can go just around the panel and ask, how concerned are they about fragmentation in markets? And what sort of evidence are they seeing? And what does it mean in practical terms? Perhaps we can start with Pierre at the end there.
Okay. First, let me check. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay, sounds good. When you have such a large crisis and the response comes from different levels, global with the G20, European, and at some point also national, it's almost unavoidable that you're going to have coherence issues across rules that are being applied. And there are several that have already been looked at pretty carefully, but I could give you some technical ones that seem to be technical ones, but in fact could have significant financial implications for banks. One of them are these new bail-in rules. There are rules that emanate from the G20, that apply to all the large, systemically important banks in the world, top 30 banks. And the rules there are called TLAC, Total Loss Absorption Capacity, and they have exactly the same overall objective as the European rules called Bail-in MREL, but they're organized differently. And these large banks are going to have to find a way of meeting both without having extra costs, extra complexities, notwithstanding that it's not the same timetable. Now, you might think that's not very significant. After all, that's one of the many technical things that comes around. But after all, the impact of these new bail-in rules, if I can call them that way, the impact on the common tier one of these large banks could be as large as the new capital requirements. They could actually move the core tier one from anywhere around 10, 11% to close to 20%. And therefore, for these banks, it is very significant. And that comes from the fact that there was thinking that took place in parallel between the G20 and the European rules. That's one example of fragmentation, if you wish, in the market that is caused by this layering of rules that you have. Gold plating, I don't have in a Swiss environment to talk about gold plating. There's always talk about the public authorities, the supervisors, seeking to do a race to the bottom, protect their banks against excessive regulation. But actually, sometimes you've got a race to the top. And you have almost every country in Europe that has been adding certain rules in certain environments. It's sometimes on the capital side, sometimes it's the the conservation buffer that is going to be higher in some countries than elsewhere, like in the Netherlands. In Belgium, it is the liquidity coverage ratio that was applied even before it needed to be applied at European level. Again, that creates fragmentation, that creates a sense of inconsistencies. Later, I think we should be talking about operational risk, but I suggest that we do that separately.
Good. So let's hear from two banks before we go to Andrea to defend the regulators. Urs, what does fragmentation mean to you? I mean, have they got some of it right? I mean, or does it all need sewing up into one seamless framework?
Well, one seamless framework is probably a wishful
thinking.
Thinking that will never happen. It never did in the past, and it will not now. What I think is important is that the cornerstones of international regulation for similarly situated banks is more or less the same, and that's not what we're having. I think Pierre has laid out very well what the reasons were and how we came about fragmented regulation. Let me maybe focus more, aside from the technical aspects of it, what that means for banks. First of all, it means significantly higher costs. I mean, the costs to comply with these enormous multiple layers of regulation, they're not 20, 40 million. We are talking hundreds of millions every year that add to your running costs in an environment where I would say margins are already quite compressed. So, I mean, I think the chief economist of UBS once mentioned it was about 900 million per year, the total cost of regulation. Not all of it, obviously, is because of fragmentation, but the significant part of it, I think, is of that. And when we look at it as to how we have to run our bank, it means added capital costs because capital may be locked in certain jurisdictions. Talk about IHC in the US, you talk about the UK rules, talk about the Swiss rules. So that is the cost aspect. But there's only one aspect of it. From a system stability point of view, I think I'm much more worried about what the impact is from what I would call a regulatory operational risk point of view.
Well, that's a new term we've heard.
And that is basically to what extent, regulators across the globe after the crisis justifiably set out to create a system that would increase system stability. And they've done that by doing a lot of things, I think, in my opinion, right, more capital, other liquidity rules. But if there is no coherence about the fundamental topics of that regulation, including actually resolution mechanisms, or recovery and resolution mechanisms, then the problem is that you create potentially a new risk, a new systemic, that can have a systemic impact also. And it will have a systemic impact. And a lot of it has to do, in my opinion, because we focus a lot on resolving the evil we knew, but we may not have really looked as to what the assessment would show under the various scenarios with that regulation that come about. I mean, look at liquidity in the markets. Some of these rules may have had as a result that liquidity in the corporate bond market, for instance, went down. Now, what that does to you in normal circumstances, you can see. In a bit more stressed situation, you can probably see now. What it will do in really stressed situations, we don't know. So I would say that aspect we have probably not looked at enough. And my plea would be that, we have a more intense dialogue also among regulators above and beyond the FSB or G20. Keep, to the extent possible, on the fundamental rules, proximity to global standards. And what we should also do, have mutual recognition of legislation that, aims to resolve the same issue in a way that you don't have to do it 5 times in whatever topic you have to adhere to.
Well, regulatory operational risk. Sylvie, is that something that's familiar in your day?
Yes, of course. Coming back to your question about the fragmentation, and it goes back to harmonization. I think that you speak about the implementation challenges and about the cost. But I guess if you come back to the what was the initial objective of all that, was to avoid fragmentation, in fact, and to enhance harmonization. But there is 2 different ways of looking at harmonization. Either you harmonize the rules, or you harmonize the outcome. And I guess the objective was, of course, to harmonize the outcome, to put everybody on the same competitive level, but much more easier to harmonize the rules. And in fact, if you apply the same rules to something that is different from the start, then the outcome is different. And that's where we are. If you take two examples, if you want to constrain the global economy through banking regulation, but then if you have in the part of the world banks that finance 80% of the economy, and in other part of the world, banks that finance 30% of the economy, then if you apply to those banks the same rule, the impact of the economy will be in one place much more stronger than in other place. Take another example. If you want to decrease the leverage of banking institutions, and if you apply to all institutions in the world the same rules, but if you have in some part of the world a big part of the assets which are not on the bank's balance sheet, like mortgages, and if you apply the same rules, and in the other banks who keep the mortgages on the balance sheet, you have much more impact. So basically, because it was much more easier to harmonize the rules than to harmonize the outcome, in fact, that was what was done, and the outcome is now different. So that was from the design of the regulation. And then, of course, when you look at the implementation, it's another area where you do have differences, because if you take the European rules, if you take directives, they have to be implemented in different countries, taking into account different regulation in terms of legal aspect, in terms of fiscal aspect, and then you end up with something very different. If you take the transposition of Basel II, for example, which was a directive, if you look at the UK transposition, and if you look at either the French or the German transposition, you could never imagine that it was coming from the same rule, because the transposition was so different. So
what's the answer there? How can you impose harmony? There's no global government. The SFB rules are not binding, really. Basel's not binding in law, as we've seen with the US and other parts of the world. So how do you get around that to have real harmonization, to get those outcomes that are the same?
Well, it's very difficult. That's why we don't have that currently, clearly. And if you take one example, which was very important in last week's market movement, which is a movement on AT1 or cocoa. In fact, it's something that the idea was the same everywhere, but the way it was transposed in national legislation was very different. And if you take Germany, for example, in fact, all the AT1 that we have to issue has to fulfill a specific German test that nobody understands. You have to check whether it complies with German GAAP. And basically, that's very different what you have with IFRS, US GAAP, or any other rules in other countries. So that makes things very difficult to understand. And currently, that's where we are. And I'm very happy that the Commission now tries to improve and to adopt regulation rather than directive, because they don't have to be transposed in national legislation. And everything that can foster harmonization is welcome in a way.